Um, we're going to now do the method of confrontation. And often when we think about confrontation, we think about debate. But really, confrontation happens all the time, that we think about our faith in confronting the world, or the world's issues confronting our own faith. So let's look at 23 to 27 here. This is the part about the disciples, right after the story of the young man coming up to Jesus and having been confronted with his wealth. And then the Jesus looking around with the disciples, and they were perplexed at that profound word there, and they were astounded. And said, and this whole thing about the eye of the needle of the camel, which some people have said, well, that's really not about a camel, it's about a gate, the Jerusalem gate, and a smaller gate, and the having to take the load off of the animals so they can get through the gate, or it's really about ropes and all sorts of ways to kind of avoid this issue. Or maybe it's just hyperbole. But if you come right back to it, it really leaves us with the question of wealth, and what do we do with wealth? You know, for many, many years, wealth was seen as a blessing of God, but then we just had this go sell everything you have. So what do you see in this text about the issues of Jesus? And then the issues of today, what kind of issues do you feel that we're confronted with in terms of wealth? What issues do you see in our contemporary society in terms of wealth? What are we confronted with?
I mean, one thing that I ponder right away when I look at this text is I think about how sort of the cultural phenomenon of how a sort of wealth has been associated with Christian identity. And I think that this text might be very uncomfortable for many people who are not necessarily in the way that Christians started, in kind of in a minority and in a poverty situation. It's changed a little bit with like Western American Christianity. So, like for example, I think that my parents, who are doing very well and are very faithful Lutheran Christians, would be pretty upset looking at this text and say, well, we worked hard to earn this money and ethically and faithfully, and now I'm not allowed in the kingdom. So I think it's a very hard text to hear.
What about others?
I think about my experience in Oakland, California in 2011 and 2012 when the Occupy movement was gaining traction. And the thing that sticks out the most to me, I mean, in a lot of ways it was about the homeless population in those cities of San Francisco and Oakland. You know, there were tent cities, and groups of people had set up places to give out free food. And I think of the tension that there was of a system that said there are these rules that you have to follow as far as policies to be able to feed people and give out free food for safety and all of that, and that confronting the fact that there are people who are out there giving food to people who need it. Just that sort of, like, you know, there were a lot of conflicts like that throughout the months.
Yeah.
I think about how we're confronted with economic disparity, and that's seen on like a local level as well as across the world. Particularly, I kind of view it with the lens of the issue of climate change, just because that's an area that I've been involved in. And it's often people who are contributing who live in a wealthy lifestyle, who have the ability to can afford to waste resources or to not being mindful of our resources that leads to effects in the environment that often affect disproportionately like people who don't have the mobility to move, like there's a hurricane, or people who live on the coast and who live on other countries around the world who are like island states who may not have the resources that we do. And I know that like the United States particularly has been critiqued a lot for our role in this global issue. So even, and that could go, so I guess I just feel like I read the text and I feel like regardless of my personal financial situation, am I complicit in this larger phenomenon that's like wider than my personal like checkbook or resources?
I think of less the actual dollar amount itself, and I think of the stewardship of it. Is somebody, if two people have $1 million, one person might just use it to quench their appetite, regardless of what that money then does. And somebody else could steward it well and perhaps invest in a community, invest in a way that creates jobs and wealth for others and benefits others. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to have a return on that, but I think that it says something about intentions and about stewardship of those resources.
This is a text that confronts us. We carry the scriptures and the scriptures carry us. One could see only law in this text. As you look at it, what do you see in terms of law, and do you also see any gospel here?
I know I searched for gospel right away with this text because I hear it so hard to people that I love. And one thing that I think about, if this is a convicting text when we're talking about how to distribute our wealth or how that might impact our faith, I think about what posture I would take with who I'm talking to. And I think when Jesus is saying how hard it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God, I want to hear that in a gospel kind of way. I want to hear that as a compassionate expression by saying, maybe there's so much fear of death and you're holding so hard onto money for power and control that you can't release it and trust me and have the joy of trusting me. So I think about how I might present a sermon to people who I love very much and are very wealthy and feel a lot of security and pride and identity in that wealth. And I wouldn't say you're bad because you have money, and try to distribute it. There's different ways to go about it.
That's really helpful, Allie, because how hard it is does sound compassionate. We've talked all along about people really need to be embraced by the gospel as part of a witness, embraced by the gospel before they can really hear the depths of the law. And how hard it must be for you, I'm guessing feels compassionate before we really hear the bad news and before we then can hear also the gospel. Do you see gospel words in here as well?
I think the last verse, it says, for mortals it is impossible, but not for God. For God all things are possible. I just think of that text that it's going to be beyond our comprehension. The gospel, the power of the gospel.
For rich and poor, for whatever things in climate change, things are impossible, but with God, God's grace makes possible new ways to live and new ways to live together. Thank you. You want to say?
Well, I really like what Christy just said, because I think we even try to harness the power of the gospel, and this is really saying you can't do that. You can't turn around. Like, it's just not even possible to take the gospel and turn it around for profit, which is what we would do if we could.
Well, and I was thinking about the Occupy movement that you were talking about too, and how that is like a strong and convicting message to talk about how like we can distribute wealth and Like, how do we make sure that that's not harnessing the gospel in a way where it's like removing the gospel from someone else? Like, how do you take a stand for what the gospel is saying without taking it away from someone else? I mean, because I know you were very committed to that. Like, how did you have conversations with people that weren't like crushing? Did you have any experience with that?
There's more questions and more questions. There's more questions. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. Why don't you just stay here, okay? Extended possibilities. I'll just stay here too. In some ways, this does go together because we talk about learning leads to mission and leads us out into the world where our goals and our gods are challenged each day, particularly as this class got into, oh, we erased it here, but the gods, you were really going on that. I was, you know, we're kind of in the middle there with the values and whatever. We got to the gods and wow. And here then we come into this. The extended possibilities are for you to think about your classes this week and to think about your learnings and how they send you forth to mission and ministry, okay? Think about them in that way. So as we began earlier, we don't just come to seminary to, oh, we got learning, good for us. And also an extended possibility, read into chapter 8, into our vocations, whether as a banker or someone in the Occupy movement or whatever our vocations are, and how we are indeed challenged as learners to be able to serve people so others might know and experience God's gracious love. Thank you all very, very much. Okay? Good.